Hello, I'm Steve Pettifer and I lecture at the University of Manchester. The university's recently announced that it's moving to blended learning and, well, it's all kicking off online at the moment, so I thought I'd make a quick video to try and explain what blended learning is and also what it isn't. I think a lot of the confusion comes from the term online lectures because it means so many different things in different contexts, and it also means that blended learning gets muddled up with the kind of emergency teaching that we've had to do during the pandemic. But online lectures is really not what blended learning is about. I think maybe the best way of explaining what blended learning means is to use an example of a course on advanced computer graphics that I've taught for something like 20 years now. It's a course about the maths and the algorithms that allow you to generate photorealistic three-dimensional scenes with reflections and shadows and that kind of stuff. When I first started teaching the course, it looked something like this. There'd be a lecture on, let's say, Monday afternoon in Lecture Theatre 1.4 in the Kilburn building, let's say. And in that, I would talk through a particular concept like ray tracing or radiosity or the rendering equation, and students would largely listen and sometimes make notes and maybe ask questions. But from the student's perspective, it was a fairly passive way of learning, mostly just listening to me say stuff. Each week there'd also be some homework to do, and in the case of my course, that would mean reading a chapter of the textbook that covered the same material that we'd looked at in the lecture to help reinforce your understanding. And there'd also be a few scientific papers on the same subject to read, which would cover that week's topic from a different perspective. In the early days of the course, you'd need to buy the textbook and we'd hand out printed copies of the papers. But for quite some years now, those have been digital versions, and that's a lot more convenient. It means students don't have to pay out for a physical textbook, and it also saves a bunch of trees from being turned into pulp. And of course, the homework, you just do it at a time that suits you. So let's say first thing Wednesday afternoon. So the traditional version of my course would look like this: an hour with me on Monday, and then an hour of guided self-study later on in the week. The course actually has a bunch of other things like a mini project and drop-in clinics, but because blended learning doesn't really change any of those, I'm just going to leave them out of this video to keep things simple. Now, there's an alternative way of delivering this course, which is sometimes called flipped learning. And here I'd really just swap the sessions. So instead of doing the homework as a kind of revision of the lecture, you'd be reading stuff in advance of the lecture with the idea that then later in the week, instead of me talking at you for an hour, you'd have a better understanding of the material from having done the pre-work. And in the lecture, we could go deeper into that material. You'd have more meaningful questions, and rather than me reciting stuff that I'd prepared beforehand, you'd be able to use my expertise to help you understand bits from the readings that hadn't quite made sense. So it's still me leading the discussion and still a bit like a lecture, but way more interactive. Now, whether you'd call this a lecture because it's no longer just me lecturing, or maybe a seminar or a workshop, it really doesn't matter, and different topics lend themselves to different structures and use slightly different terminology. But maybe in this case, let's call it an interactive lecture for now. But it still takes place in Kilburn Lecture Theatre 1.4 or wherever. It's just a far better use of your time, and you get far more value out of me. And actually for me it's a lot more fun too, rather than just repeating the same material every year. And this way of teaching isn't new. Humanities in particular have been doing this for a very long time. The only real difference with blended learning is that instead of it being a bunch of things to read, you've now got specially made digital content that you access online. And this is where the confusion over online comes in, I think. So in the case of my course, you've got a series of short videos made by me, kind of like this one really, that have been made specifically for the course, and they explain things that are in the textbook or in the papers in exactly the way that I want you to understand them. And unlike a live lecture, if you don't understand something I've said in the video, obviously you can rewind it and rewatch it as many times as you like at a time that works for you. And then, when we come to meet in the real world later in the week, we can go far deeper into the subject in a much more interesting way. We spend just as much time together as we would have done in the traditional model. We're just making better use of that time. And if you're wondering if it's such a simple change, why has the university even bothered to announce it? It's because from the perspective of staff, it does mean us learning to do things differently, learning new techniques to get the most out of this format, and it means the university making a significant investment in the tools and the support that we'll need to make this work. So there you go. That's pretty much all there is to blended learning. Best of digital content, blended with the best bits of real world interaction.